Okay, it's 2 minutes past 3, and I think we'll make a start. So welcome everyone. This is the 6th of 6 in this series of the global webinar series. And as you know, many have been following it for the last several weeks. We've been looking at the United States foreign policy, deconstructing it, looking at its imperial, hierarchical, and racialized core. And we've sort of conceived of it this time as a kind of short course on understanding American power and its drivers and dynamics and so on, and looking at it from a variety of perspectives, including from a variety of global perspectives as well. Global majority scholars, scholars from the global south, but also in conversation with scholars based in and from the global north too. And the idea behind the whole global webinar series is that there is a lot to be learned by listening to people who have expertise and experience and knowledge from different parts of the world, from different disciplines, different perspectives, theoretical or other, and using different methodologies too. And it's been very, very enlightening for us who followed the whole series to hear those disparate voices. So in the first week, for example, we covered and interrogated the whole idea of American exceptionalism as a kind of bedrock ideology of the American system of power and American ideology itself. Then we looked at the kind of America and the racial capitalism concept and practices, as well as in the third week, we looked at the sort of building of a white Anglo-American world order and the role of the United States within that. The following week, the week 4, we looked at America and violence and the role of violence in the rise of the United States and in its kind of exercise of power on a global stage. And then last week, we looked at the United States as a knowledge empire, that the kind of, in a way, what some people argue that American power or American empire has been constructed far more by intellectual penetration than it has been by territorial acquisition. So those 5 weeks, we looked at those topics, and we also wanted then to kind of look at one of the most important questions for the world today, and the most important strategic relationship in the world today, the United States and China. So today we're going to look at that subject. We've got 3 really interesting and excellent speakers coming up. And I would like to say to the audience that please feel free at any point during this panel to put your questions, type your questions into the Q&A, which is right at the bottom of your screen, you'll be able to see, and we will then later on. So each speaker will have 18 to 20 minutes to make their presentation. Each speaker will speak one after the other, and then we'll have about 20 to 25 minutes Q&A to follow. So thanks very much for joining, and I'll hand over to Oz, who will do the introductions of our speakers this afternoon.
Super.
Thanks, Oz.
Thanks. Really happy to have 3 excellent speakers today. First off, we are going to have Xing, who's a professor in the Department of Politics and Society at Aalborg University in Denmark. He's the editor-in-chief of the Journal of China in International Relations. He's a prolific author of over 278 publications, which is extraordinary. And he's currently authoring a monograph, China and the US Rivalry and Regional Reordering in Latin America. And in 2020, he received a Teacher of the Year award. So very prolific, and very pleased to have him here. Unfortunately, his camera's flickering in and out because of a technical issue with Zoom. I'm sure the presentation worked out. So that's part of the technicalities of being online. So our second speaker is Rizwana Abbasi, who is an associate professor at National University of Modern Languages in Islamabad and a fellow of the East-West Institute in the United States of America. She's the author of multiple monographs, and the latest of which is Building a Road to Nuclear Disarmament. And she's also a prolific writer of multiple articles and media engagements around the world. And finally, we have Chen Zhang, who's a lecturer in politics and IR at Queen's University, Belfast. She's also published widely in very high impact journals, including EJIR, the Review of International Studies, and the European Journal of Social Theory. Her latest article was recently published in January 2022, and it's actually already been downloaded over 3,000 times and is already in the top 10 most read articles in Review of International Studies, which is just extraordinary to have that level of readership within such a short amount of time. But I think that's testament to the absolute top quality of this panel today.
Great. Thanks very much, Oz.
We're going to make we can start with Lee. Are you ready to go?
Yeah. Yeah.
Lee, can you unmute, please?
Okay, is that okay? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Osman, and I want to thank the organizer of this series web seminar. And I think it's very important. I do not need to introduce more about the theme of seminar of today. And I'm a professor in international politics, and in recent many years, especially during the last 10 years, I have edited many books on the theme of the rise of China and the impact on global order, and from different regional and different thematic perspectives. Okay, so now today I'm going to focus on US-China rivalry, which is one of the key themes which I've been doing research for the last couple of years. Okay, I will go through very quickly some key points, then I stop it. Okay, I should give more time for discussion. The first aspect is economic relations. The second aspect is the competition between two economic systems. The third aspect, military security, and the last aspect is future scenarios. First of all, if we talk about economic relations, I think this is need to be, need to be taught to all, to the audience, that they should understand what is economic relations between China, because there are many, different stories. But let me be very brief. First of all, it's this made in China, what is called the scenario, okay, or made in China model, which is one of the key relationship between US and China during the 1980s until 2010s. Okay, basically the made in China model is that China in the middle, then you have technology, equipment from other Eastern Asian countries, then you have resources from Africa, from Southeast Asia, from other regions, countries, then you have a financial support from Hong Kong and Singapore. Then you make everything in China, and then you export to US, export to Europe, export to the rest of the world. And this create two consequences. One is decentralization in the north, others is decentralization in the south. For the north, they do not need to produce, they can just let China to produce, which is a win-win situation. Both for the south, they do not produce either. They cannot compete with China. Then for the second, they can just sell their resources for a good price. So basically, these are the two consequences. Okay? If you look at the US-China relations, exactly if you look at the circle, okay, when China send the goods to the United States, US pay dollar, China has a massive dollar, then buy US treasury, then support US purchase of more Chinese products, and the US has more order to China, and China produce more. If this circle for 10 or 15 years, 20 years, then you say that the US economy is losing more and more in manufacturing, but more and more concentrate on financialization, whereas the Chinese become more and more industrialized, manufacture-based, and let the finance be controlled by the US at that time. Okay, so it is kind of win-win situation for 2 or 3 decades. But then comes the problem. Then now we begin to talk about US-China contradictions. That when China began to give up its old growth model, which was a win-win situation between US and China, moved to the new growth model, which is quite, look like what is economies today in advanced countries, okay? Basically, it's big transition from export to consumption, from manufacturing to service, from low value to high tech product, et cetera, et cetera. So now the relationship becoming kind of win or lose relationship rather than win-win since the mid 2010s, especially when China moved to the core high-tech products areas. So this is what we call economic relation from win-win to win-lose relationship, especially when China moved to the high-tech products, okay, 5G, AI, robot, et cetera, and that even increased the tension and made United States think China is becoming a systemic rivalry or systemic rival, because if you on the left side, if you only produce or export shadow goods means the daily wears, okay, daily wears, shoes, clothes, etc., and that those products do not produce any systemic rival, or because they do not have any non-value generation effect. But now when you go to the high value based products or high technology, then you begin to think about, because those products, they really lead to the non-value issues. Trade, when Trump came to power, and basically he started the trade war, but the consequence of the war, and we all know that last year, actually China-US trade even increased 28.7%. China had even much more huge surplus, okay? And today, and in the US, the greatest debate is how United States should reduce the tariff on Chinese goods without losing face. That is today actually we are facing today. Now the final areas within the economic domain, that is the finance. That, as I said, that China focus on manufacturing, whereas the United States maintain to be the global power or hegemon in finance. But the Ukraine war is really teaching China lessons, and China now is going to speed up its financial independence, especially by creating a new alternative they call the digital money, Chinese yuan. And also China's CPAs, this cross-border payments, they all aimed at, to some extent, not replace, but at least play an independent role outside the SWIFT system. And now China is trying to, make deals with many other countries, including oil exporting countries in the Gulf, that they can do business in yuan rather than in dollar. Okay. Ideologically, these two systems, when they, as I said, when they had these good deals in 1980s, 1990s, and 2000, there was no debate about this capitalism, state capitalism vis-a-vis liberal capitalism, because China's whatever capitalism China had, it suited U.S. interests. But now, when the competition starts, when the rivalry starts, now United States begin to ideologize its competition with China. Okay, so if we quote Hanania's article, he said even China's success did not harm U.S. in any way, but still become a threat, because how can United States spread its democratic value to the rest of the world when another economic system under the one-party system is becoming much more successful? So this is a dilemma as well. Okay. Then military. In the military, you can read the Pentagon's two reports. They are talking about China is beginning to leading in 3 areas. Okay, Navy and China's developing the stealth bomb, the GPS competition, the space station competition, especially the most dangerous issue, that is Taiwan issue. Okay, we can discuss it later on. And now United States trying to strengthen its bloc-based alliance. Then you have a NATO and Europe, and then you have in East Asia, you have a Five Eyes, you have AUKUS, you have a Quad, then you have a lot of bilateral treaties. But that's kind of block-based security architecture, or is really pushing China and Russia to come in even closer to each other. If you look at Ukraine war, actually the whole world is divided. The world is divided, okay? According to the Economist, you can see there on the left side, okay? So I want to have a debate on two scenarios. If we agree on the basis of China's continuous economic growth, okay, if we base our assumption China continue to grow in about 10 years, then what will happen to the US-led world order? Either it will have a disorder, which means that there will be superpowers that we all give up the existing order, so there will be disorder. Then either we'll have a new order, which means that the two superpowers, together with other powers, they come up with new rules and games, okay, new norms. Or we have a world reorder, which means that the United States is ready to accommodate China into the system. So the existing rules will be kind of reconsidered, redesigned in order to accommodate China's wish. But there is another scenario. I want to introduce one of my founding application, which has been approved in Denmark. That is 3 professors. We are doing a big funding project on our theorization of the world order in the future. That is multi-order world. In the future, there will be no only US world order with different poles. Okay, you have different poles. You have Russia, China. No, we are actually theorizing that the world is going to face multi-order world, which means there are different orders. Countries are grouping together around one superpower or one big power along the lines of identity, culture, history, etc., etc. So basically, there will be 3, but there might be other. Okay, I'm not, because it's kind of future studies. Then Africa, Latin America, other developing countries, they will align themselves and choose between them, okay, according to their interests. This can be also a kind of scenario. I think I stop here. I hope I'm not exceeding 20 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You're well within your time, actually. So thank you very much. Very interesting. Lots of food for thought there. And quite a few questions, I would think, emerging in people's minds, and certainly in mine as well. Okay, thank you very much, Lee, for that. We'll move on to Rizwana, our second speaker. So Rizwana, you have about 18 to 20 minutes for your presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, I'm grateful to the relevant team for giving me this opportunity to share my view with you on this particular platform. So my views basically focus on evolving power politics in Asia Pacific and its impact on deepening security dilemma between India and Pakistan in South Asia, particularly in South Asia, and relationship between India and Pakistan. So first of all, I would like to talk about global power shift, and I'll see that how this global power shift leads to create great power rivalry in Asia Pacific, thereby leading to create impact for India and Pakistan. So if I take a lead building argument on global power shift, as we all know that the distribution of global power is constantly changing, and the future is never certain, but current political shift, global power shift suggests that the US and China appear uniquely positioned to dominate the world politics. So the transition away from American unipolarity and growing Chinese capabilities ensure that the world will enter a new era of multipolarity where Asian century seems to become a reality. It goes indeed without saying that US still remains the world's largest individual market. It holds the largest and most powerful armed capacity, network of global bases and relationships. US is the largest energy exporter that hosts the most powerful technological firms and also holds knowledge dominance at the global level. But US hegemony, in my view, is in crisis, and the US century is over. Why I argue that is that the US has proven to be the most hyper-interventionist great power of this century. US is facing shrinking alliance system. US self-inflicted damage was liberal hegemonic designs, as was argued by John Mearsheimer in his The Great Delusions. Invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, all its dissipations such as torture, mass surveillance, militarism, and authoritarianism are the glaring examples. So instead of using democratic power and power of negotiations, the US over-relied on military means in Afghanistan. So fall of Afghanistan has brought certain damages to US reliability, credibility, and its alliance cushion. More so, I would argue that US faces leadership crisis, polarization and image problem at home, whereas huge reputation and credibility problems at a global level. So in parallel, we have witnessed that China has emerged as competitor through trade, investment, and diplomacy. Chinese power increasingly has global reach. So Russia also lately projected influence in Eastern Europe and Middle East. So the resurgence of Russia and the continued rise of China have created a new period of greater power rivalry. But I would like to argue that the structure of the rule-based international order will now have to be shared. So coming multipolarity has become a reality, and 21st century belongs to Asia. So end of American century and demise of its empire and its preeminent role in the world now is visible. So I would like to simply move on to the argument that how this then leads to create greater power rivalry in Asia Pacific. So when we talk about Asia Pacific, I would say that, of course, US and China are the two prominent players in the Asia Pacific politics. So US wants to project its power in Asia in order to promote and dominate economic growth. Secondly, it wants to sustain the longer term, of course, footprint in Asia Pacific, and it wants to, at the same time, create defense balance with China. So, of course, US also aims at constraining and resisting China's rise. It wants to protect sea lines of communications that are pivot to its economy and to preserve oil and trade routes from Middle East and Africa, and wants to enjoy broader freedom in navigation of movement in Asian waters, and wants to secure and maximize its own exports to Asia Pacific region as future economy lies in Asia. So how US is projecting its power, as well highlighted by my worthy previous speaker, is that through US is projecting power through bilateral, trilateral, and multilateral alliance system. So bilaterally, US is deepening its alliance system with India, South Korea, Japan, and Australia. At the trilateral level, of course, AUKUS system is appearing to be more prominent, through which US wants to install and plant its batteries in Asia and Asian waters. At the multilateral level, of course, Quad system, East Asia Summit, ASEAN, states, and the APEC, that is Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, are the forums through which the US is trying to project its political and economic influence. Lately, they have introduced Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, through which they aim at countering Chinese growing economic influence over ASEAN or East Asian countries. Within that, I think I would argue that US is also trying to reinforce its military footprint in Asia to project its long-term power projection in the region. So through military means, of course, we have seen and we witnessed that US is improving its C2 command and control system. Within that, it is improving and expanding nuclear production and simulation facilities. For example, it is expanding its nuclear, sea-launched ballistic missiles, air-launched cruise missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles. It has also installed its THAAD technologies in South Korea. It is planning on and aiming at installing BMD system, Aegis BMD system, and Patriot PAC-3 batteries in Asia. It is working on installing CPGS systems to counter China's A2AD, that is area access, anti-access area denial capabilities in the Asia Pacific region and in blue waters of Asia. It is also trying to install, B1, B2, and B52 bombers, and it has stationed these bombers actually in Guam territory. So more so, I think I would say that United States of America is also forging in order to initiate joint exercises with all the countries, and it has crafted range of agreements on information and technology sharing with the countries. It is sharing surveillance means with the partners in Asia, and it aims at constraining China in South and East China Sea, thereby creating Malacca dilemma for China. As we know that Chinese, 40% of China's oil imports are through Strait of Malacca, and through, I think, the Strait of Hormuz accounts for 40% of China's oil import, and Strait of Malacca accounts for, I believe, 82% of China's oil imports. So these actually two straits are very important for China, where it is being challenged by the United States alliance system. So now I would like to move on to another argument as to how China is trying to sustain this pressure and maintain its rise and assertiveness in the broader Asia Pacific region. We cannot contest this argument that China's BRI vision has completely transformed the global order through which it wants to initiate regional connectivity and economic growth. At the same time, China wants to protect its sea lines of communication and South and East China Seas, and wants to also create defense balance with United States of America. So under the BRI vision, China is building and constructing various ports that are quite significant, such as Gwadar in Pakistan, Hambantota in Sri Lanka, Sitwe Port and Popo Islands of Myanmar, Chittagong Port of Bangladesh, Bagamoyo Port in Tanzania. So China has come up with its own institutional framework, that is AIIB. At the moment, we witness that one of 5 countries are member to AIIB. SCO is another regional institutional framework which is coming up in a big way, and growing. Chinese economic influence over ASEAN countries cannot be overlooked. So BRICS and RCEP are the two another important, I would say, institutional mechanisms in Asia. So our 15 countries account for about 30% of global GDP. That is largest trading bloc that include largest economies in Asia is RCEP. So in parallel to this, I would say that China is also trying to create balance in military domain. So China is coming up with quite a comprehensive, military program, which is like they are building aircraft carriers, they are building and introducing new SSBN systems, intercontinental ballistic missiles, multiple independent re-entry vehicles, area A2AD system, anti-access area denial systems, and their BMD systems are quite, comprehensive program. And then cruise missiles is another, significant induction that they have undertaken. Then hyper-glided vehicles are quite robust mechanism that they have introduced. And China is, possessing extensive modern offensive cyber capabilities and somehow outpacing US in artificial intelligence. So these are the assertive moves that China has, undertaken. So this in turn leads to create pressure on, India and Pakistan, and relationship between India and Pakistan too. So India is a bigger player in the Asia Pacific region, conceding its status-driven ambitions from the outset based on its greater India vision. So India, on the one hand, is hedging in favor of US against China. India wants to seek parity instead of building balance with China, and India wants to mainstream itself in the global club through the US alliance system in order to uplift its political stature. So within that, of course, under the US alliance system, nuclear suppliers group favor is a significant move that has given mainstreaming to India in the global system. India has become a member to MTCR, missile technology regime, and Wassenaar arrangements. India has, struck a range of significant bilateral deals and agreements with United States of America, such as DTI and Logistics Support Agreement, such as Logistic Exchange Memorandum of Agreements, such as Communication Compatibility and Security Agreement, such as Communication and Information Security Memorandum of Agreement, BECA, that is Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreements, along with range of exercises that they have undertaken with the United States of America. So India at the same time is building and forging ahead in terms of building their multilateral, bilateral, extra-regional and bilateral regional alliance system. So India is a big player in Quad system. India has built its bilateral arrangements with US, Russia, France, EU, and Israel. But at the same time, at the regional level, China is a partner to Vietnam, Myanmar, Iran, Qatar, Maldives, Seychelles, South Africa, and Australia, so on and so forth. So India is coming up again technologically in a big way in the Southern Asian region. India, under the NSC waiver, is not only indigenizing its industry, but also, of course, building through collaborative efforts its stride capability. So Ariane class, nuclear submarines they have introduced. They are, introducing different kind of SLBMs, that are sea-launched ballistic missiles. At the same time, they are, introducing and launching cruise missiles and different kind of destroyers and frigates and forwards in the blue seas. Hypersonic glided vehicles and MUR technologies are the important moves that India has introduced. India is also, achieving and getting accuracy and mastery in, cyber technologies, and also trying to acquire AI, related mastery in the near future. But UAVs are the more relevant, I would say, platforms that they have inducted at the land and sea domain. So this in turn, of course, creates a lot of pressure for Pakistan as a smaller state, which consider India as a staunch rival. So these kind of, arrangements and these kind of developments have created a lot of costly, I would say, arms race problems in the region, not only between India and China, but also between India and Pakistan. And the broader region seems to be quite risky and unstable. Deterrence is no longer, stable or remains within the boundaries of minimalism. And the states, instead of, building collaborative efforts to promote shared prosperity, they are trying to obstruct regional development and prosperity by heavily relying on militarization. So in Pakistan is also in turn, now I would like to build argument, building response and is wary of what is going on in our backyard. So at the national level, as we know that Pakistan is trying to realign and maximize its economic gains. Pakistan secondly wants to build balance, not parity with India, considering its, of course, depressing economy. Thirdly, Pakistan wants to maximize its security and avoid war at all costs. Why? As you know that under Imran Khan's government, Pakistan has first ever time introduced, national security document that carries, a policy of comprehensive national security. So that comprehensive national security means that the human security and economic growth are at the center of the comprehensive security policy. So Pakistan aims at and wants to, build regional connectivity, and through regional connectivity wants to, focus on national development, particularly through China-Pakistan economic corridor. That is our hope for Pakistan. So Pakistan at the same time wants to play a balancing role amid greater powers rivalry. So thereby minimizing, dependence on solely on Western-centric institutions and adopting, Pakistan aims at adopting diversified means for national growth and economic stability. Within that, Pakistan also wants to, of course, maximize its security through credible minimum, by maintaining credible minimum deterrence. So aim is not parity, but balance. At the same time, of course, India's heavy investment in its stride system also compel Pakistan to modify and strengthen its stride capability, particularly in the sea domains. So Pakistan's cruise missile and MUR technologies are quite robust platforms at this stage to create balance with India. And Pakistan also wants to focus on shared construction of conventional submarines with China, and wants to focus on shared constructions of other powers and other technologies, particularly that are conventional and allowed under the international framework. So I would like to conclude by saying that how new era of stability can be introduced in the broader Southern Asian region. I think regional frameworks need to be implemented that seems to play an important role. China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is a bilateral arrangement. I view that this arrangement needs to be transformed into a multilateral, comprehensive, arrangement. So there is need to build cross-regional connectivity in order to promote socio-economic development and increase trade volumes and promote shared prosperity for the welfare of the people of this region. So all the countries need to play a really rational role in order to build trust and avoid wars and confrontation, probability and possibility of confrontation. There is need to address common threats through joint mechanisms. For that, I think regional institutions such as SCO plays a significant role and offers a platform where all the states can sit together and understand and address their shared challenges. Policy of accommodation should be adopted instead of confrontation. So when we talk about under the sea at Gwadar port of Pakistan, so Gwadar port has become pretty controversial. That uses a lot of pressure, international pressure for Pakistan. So I think linking Jahabad to Gwadar for social prosperity and uplifting standard of the people of all the leading states would be important. So instead of focusing on confrontation, there is need to build knowledge-based new economy through shared research and new trends of scientific discoveries. Finally, I would like to conclude by saying that there is need to really introduce, arms control mechanism in South Asia. This weaponization of outer space, in blue waters would probably yield not favorable dividends. So there is need to initiate bilateral dialogues between maybe China and India and Pakistan. There is need to implement and maybe craft new arms control mechanisms to consider budgetary constraints, understanding how much is sufficient for their maximization of security. And finally, I think there is a need to open up all the communication channels and confidence building channels between China and India and Pakistan in order to minimize space of war and maximize peace. So with this note, I would like to thank you all for your patience and attention. I would end here.
Great. Thank you very much, Rizwana. Really very interesting and nice sentiments at the very end of your talk as well about the region and the possibilities of cooperation and development and peace, I guess, in the longer run. There'll be some questions about that, I'm sure, from our audience, but I certainly would have some as well. But thank you very much, and you've stuck fantastically to your time as well. So thank you for that. So we'll move on to our third speaker, please. Chen Chen, you have the floor. 18 to 20 minutes as for the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks to the host for organizing this, and thanks to Oz for the very generous introduction at the beginning. I learned a great deal on the economic and security aspects of US-China relations and beyond. And what I could add to this conversation, what I hope to add to this conversation is perhaps a very different perspective on global entanglement in the discursive and ideological world. And since this webinar series also had a focus on race, I think this ongoing project of mine on the global alt-right might also shed some light on the complex reproduction of global white supremacy in spaces or geographies constructed as non-white. A few words on the wider theoretical concerns behind this project or where I'm from. There has been an excellent body of work from Critical IR, I think, deconstructing Western imaginations, representations, constructions of the non-West, and constructions of international hierarchies, which I think is also part of the theme of this webinar series. But the critical analysis often doesn't extend to representational practices in places known as the non-West. All these non-Western perspectives, as are often called, are talked about as something that's completely different or self-contained rather than produced through relations of interconnections. So I'm interested in the co-constitution of binary oppositions, such as that between the West and the non-West, between China and the US, through discursive practices from both sides. And I want to illustrate this by looking at the global dimensions or the global consciousness of the transnational alt-right projects. So I'll start by trying to conceptualize the alt-right as globally entangled discursive and ideological projects. I will then revisit some of the Chinese narratives from what we might call alt-right communities and from my earlier work about these narratives about the decline of the West, and especially through the lens of race and gender. And finally, I'll pinpoint some of the ways in which the figure of China and the figure of the West function in globalized culture wars. So the alt-right is not easy to define, and the theoretical work on this subject is only beginning to emerge, and of course is mostly confined to Euro-American experiences. I'm approaching this as a loosely defined internet-based networked discursive universe that claims to oppose liberal modernity, either the liberal state or the liberal international order, from various conservative perspectives, so drawing on a variety of and sometimes contradictory intellectual resources. There's the capitalized version referring to the alt-right proper, we might say, with a political agenda and very committed activists. But here I'm more referring to the broader alt-right with small letter initials, which is perhaps more of a sensibility rather than a clear movement, characterized by sort of shared resentment towards whatever that's framed as politically correct. And there are many overlaps with the radical right, radical conservatism, or the new right, or right-wing populism. But the reason why I'm focusing on this idea and the framework of the alt-right is that it's very specifically a product of digital culture. It relies on digital network, user-generated contents, memes, and ideological entrepreneurs who thrive off social networks. It's through the internet that white supremacists on 4chan, for example, and nationalist influencers on Chinese Weibo, WeChat can share globally circulating materials of hate and articulate their own versions of racialist and masculinist politics. I take political masculinism as central to alt-right projects. So gender, there's certainly an obsession with gender as they attack feminism, reproductive rights, so-called gender ideology, and so on. But masculinism also means the enemy, whether it's values, whether it's other nations or social groups, are feminized. It promotes hyper-masculine ideas of nation and society, and believe that, as Natasha Cow has written in this wonderful article about misogyny and authoritarianism in different countries, including India, the US, Brazil, and Turkey, the anti-national animus are associated with feminists and critical race theorists, and so on. So you will see that this operates in different countries, such as China and the US. I think the global dimensions or the global consciousness of the alt-right are not explored enough. And I'm talking about global consciousness in two senses at least. It's global first in the sense that there are those troubling ideas, memes, and ideological convergence, misinformation and conspiracy theories such as those about the so-called Islamization of Europe that originated in European or international far-right media and websites are translated and popularized on Chinese Weibo and WeChat. Meanwhile, for example, the Chinese slang term Baizu or white left has been picked up by the global right as well. Carson Tucker of Fox News did 2 segments on how the Chinese are supposedly ridiculing the American liberals in 2017 and again in 2021. There are also plenty of explainers on YouTube introducing this term to the English-speaking audiences. But beyond these instances of traveling ideas, traveling memes and conspiracy theories, we should also understand ideological convergence in within specific national contexts, right? We can see the rise of misogynistic and masculinist politics in countries like China, Russia, and the US, but in some places it would be linked with religious conservatism, but in China, not so much. I would say in the Chinese context, it's more rooted in hyper-masculine form of socialist developmentalism. But then there are convergences rooted in different national trajectories. And in terms of the global circulation of racial discourses, I find it very helpful to draw on Michelle Christian's framework of malleable forms of global white supremacy and David Goldberg's relational approach to racism, racisms in plural. For Goldberg, racial ideas, meanings, exclusionary and repressive practices in one place are always influenced and shaped by those elsewhere. And Christian's framework is very useful for understanding how places constructed as non-white have the ability to reproduce global white supremacy by hierarchically positioning themselves along the field of global whiteness. And the second sense in which the global right is global, the alt-right is global projects that they entail particular visions of the global. They tend to frame the so-called national interests that are race, gendered, and classed national interests as against the global, which could mean values, globalization, or immigration. They sometimes use an anti-colonial framework. It's been noted, for example, how reactionary forces in Poland called gender quote Ebola from Brussels, end of quote. The disease metaphor really reminds me of some viral articles in Chinese cyberspace that called the white left the AIDS of human civilization. And there's also a reimagination of the West versus non-West framework by actors identifying with both geopolitical macrospheres. We know that in typical Orientalist representation, the Orient is feminized. But in these narratives about the decline of the West as a crisis of masculinity, the East becomes the adequately masculine to reflect what's wrong with the alleged feminization of men in the West. And you can see this from the comment of US conservative influencer, Candace Owens. And Trump said in his Warsaw speech, does the West have the will to defend itself, something like that. And it's kind of reminiscent of this Zhu uses comments about the instinct of survival, the West has lost it and China has it. So all these reversed imagination of the relationship between East and West and masculinity. And also like this quote from sociologist Sullivan, the West is increasingly invoked as something that's inadequately nationalist, inadequately assertive about one's cultural identity, and inadequately anti-immigration and so on. And that's exactly what we see in what we might call the Chinese version of the alt-right discourse. Some of my earlier work has been focused on this. And this discourse on the surface looks very similar to its counterpart in the Euro-American context. So there are elements such as racism, anti-immigration, Islamophobia, anti-feminism, general hostility towards social justice movements, and blaming everything on political correctness and the so-called liberal elites known as the white left. But the master narratives that the Western civilization is in crisis because of demographic change, because all the immigrants have let in, and because of the left politics of political correctness that enabled it. Very similar tropes, but as you can imagine, it's from a reversed geopolitical perspective. It's a problem of the other, and we are doing very good here because we don't have immigrants, we don't have political correctness. So we are doing just fine. Yeah, so that's why I'm reading this as a form of anti-Western politics that nonetheless reproduces Eurocentric racial civilizational hierarchy. So they simultaneously reproduce the narratives that originated from the Western far right and use them to mobilize the popular discontent with the US or West-led international order. And also important to note that different front figures such as Bannon and Dugin, they're not traditionalists. The community I was looking at, they're very much modernists, and they're not against the economic structure of the international order at all, but rather it's against the normative hierarchy, not happy with the liberal West criticisms of China, but very happy about the globalization side of things. So I think Lee's earlier comment on the competition between two capitalisms is quite relevant here. So like I looked at this website called Zhihu in my earlier work. That's a question and answer website with social media features. It's known for attracting a large user base from sort of well-educated and professionals of demographic backgrounds. And I looked at Zhihu discussions around this term, the white left, which you might be wondering what it means. It's supposed to mean someone who holds progressive values in Western societies, but pretty much, so it's kind of equivalent to social justice warrior. It's derogatory, but it's explicitly racialized. And just like any other internet slang terms, in reality, it just means anyone, a person who's using it disagrees with. But most importantly, it functions as a rhetorical device. It brings something into being by naming it and defining it in this explicitly racialized ways. By framing progressive social movements as a privilege of white elites, it effectively excludes people of color from social justice politics, and again mobilizes the resentment towards Western hegemony coded as white in Chinese society to advance racist and Islamophobic arguments. And then there are also phrases that function to homogenize non-white groups. So these enormously diverse racial, ethnic, and religious groups become a collective racialized outgroup. And then the gender dimension as well. Of course, the idea of the white left is feminized. It's understood as effeminate, with too much empathy, weak, unwilling, or unable to defend the Western civilization and so on. Very much like the word snowflakes in the English-speaking alt-right communities. Now, I also analyzed these online discussions as popular narratives of the global order and discursive construction of identity and otherness through these binary oppositions between the national self and the ethno-racial and political others. So a little update on that, because the materials I worked with a couple years ago were discourse about the white left. So it was mostly discussions about foreign societies, others' problems. And a more recent study done by Yang and Fang looked at a community of Weibo alt-right influencers, and they looked more at discussions about domestic issues within China. So like home grown Islamophobia coupled with incorporation of globally circulating scripts of Islamophobia, for example. And these materials, I think, present a very good opportunity to examine how racial discourses in spaces constructed as non-white bear a complex relationship to global white supremacy. When the reference is Western societies, for example, these posters mostly identify with Chinese diasporas and both critique and buy into white supremacy. The framing of non-white groups other than the Chinese as inferior is pretty straightforward, but the attitude towards whiteness is a mixture of admiration, resentment, appreciation, hatred, and contempt. Like saying, you are discriminating against me, I don't like it, you shouldn't because I'm as smart as you. So there's definitely opposition to discrimination, but no opposition to the hierarchy as such. When they talk about domestic issues, you have national racialized hierarchies informed by global whiteness and the victimhood discourse. As I said earlier, globally circulating scripts of Islamophobia related to terrorism and demographic change also incorporated into pre-existing ones. I don't have time for the gender aspect now because I think I only have 2 minutes left. So just some.
Chen Chen, actually, because Lee was left about 5 minutes or so from his time, so please do feel free to have another 2 or 3 minutes if you like.
Yeah, okay. So just to work quickly comment on the gender aspect, or the hyper masculine ideals of nation and society in the texts I worked with, and how this really resonates again with the masculinism in the Euro-American far right. These are ideas that emphasize authority, hierarchy, competition, aggressiveness, and capacity for violence. In terms of the scholarship on the global right, it's only recently that people started to focus on the centrality of masculinity to those ideologies, sometimes through what the Alternative für Deutschland intellectual Mark Jungen calls Timos, or white Timos. The importance of the military, warrior virtues, and so on. Now, I already commented on how the white left of the term itself is feminized. And also you can see from how these quotes I'm listing here are really emphasizing on those traits, but also there's not only the affirmation of hypermasculinism, but also again, a strong identification with hypermasculine whiteness specifically. So there's a certain degree of Schadenfreude, we are happy because you are so pathetic, but also a degree of regretful nostalgia. You're in decline now, but you've been doing so well. And so whiteness still represents power and status, but is now corrupted by whatever. And there's a certain degree of nostalgia from these Chinese texts as well. And also it's just funny that you also find this kind of feminization of university students, especially certain disciplines, liberal arts students. And there's a poster from Zhu who's saying the Chinese elites are better because we really prioritize STEM over humanities. You don't get over empathetic and you're pragmatic and so on. You can see sort of similar memes from the US side where STEM students are considered more whatever, and they would vote GOP, and English major or liberal arts students would have too much empathy and become democratic. So that's Candace Owens' quote I mentioned earlier. Again, this imagination of the West and the East framework, but the feminization relationship is almost reversed. So skip the liberal people, the dissidents people. just one word to say that they have a lot in common with the nationalists. So these are the anti-CCP people, but also they are they've become quite Trumpist. There are lots of commonalities between them, but for the nationalists, alt-right, China is already a better version of the West. They've outwested the West and saved modernity, so to speak. This quote is from a book called Prototype Nation, whereas the dissidents insist that China should get rid of the CCP and join the civilized world. So just quickly to summarize or to pinpoint some of the ways the figure of China and the figure of the West function in this global field of alt-right discourses. So for people like Steve Bannon, the figure of China definitely is the sort of enemy other at the intersection of anti-communism, anti-globalization, and also racial civilizational difference or otherness. But on the other hand, it also works in other ways as a convenient other. I also mentioned how Tucker used the Chinese term to sort of mock the liberal elites by saying that, you see the Chinese are laughing at you. And it's also used to discredit the enemies such as critical race theory when they likened it to Cultural Revolution. And it's also fantasized by some part of the alt-right, such as Richard Spencer, as adequately authoritarian, masculine, and Richard Spencer had a comment saying that this is a country run by engineers. And on the Chinese side, it's kind of similar. You have this is also instrumentalized in attacks on social movements and ethnic minorities within China. And so things like LGBT movements, feminist movements, they are delegitimized as proxies of foreign hostile forces. So I'll just stop here, maybe with this little diagram to show you how everything is connected. Sorry for going a little over.
I don't know, actually you're fine. Okay. Are you finished now, Chen Chen? Yep. All right, great. Thank you very much. That was really packed with really interesting analysis and evidence information as well. I'm sure there'll be a few questions. I have a few myself. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll go now to the Q&A. And I understand from Juvaria that there is someone who has put up their hand who would like to ask their question directly.
Yeah, we can invite them to speak.
How?
And we've done this before.
Is Tanya, are you there?
Yes, he's already, I've just asked him to, it's Kai Yu-Twin, I've just asked him to unmute.
Okay. All right, Kai, when you're ready, please ask your question.
No response.
Okay, well, I'll read out the first question in the Q&A. And this is for Lee. And it's from Rashmi Bhardwaj, a good friend of the webinar. She says, determination of the future world order. How much will this be led by the personalities of the country's leaders? Or are they figureheads only? Or are they the driving forces behind their government direction and action? So she's asking whether the country leaders of the main countries are actually driving, or they are in some way kind of representing or acting on the basis of other forces in their society. So perhaps Lee, if you want to go for that one.
Yeah, I think that is an extremely good question, but it's quite difficult because depending from IR point of view, whether you think in the realist line or in the constructive line. In the realist line, you think that the structural forces, the international political economy will be the major force for shaping the world order. Then from a constructive point of view, then you think that socialization, beliefs, culture, identity, they all play an important role. It depends, but what I'm trying to argue at the end of my presentation is that following the rivalry, then I think it's much more the structural forces that push the major powers into different directions. And once when we really in the future, if we have a multi-order world, then I think there will be a kind of a period for personality encounters. Personality does play a role, but in terms of, for example, Biden, when Biden came to power, every American, every Chinese, we expect policy changes. And no, that is not. So it means that there is a major kind of consensus in the US politics, both for the Congress and for the senators, for the administration, even for the general public, that China is the threat, China is the enemy. So no matter how you develop your personalities, as long as the structural forces is in driving force, you really can't do anything. This is my answer.
I wonder if we could just stay on that topic. I mean, surely, structural forces don't act, if you like, in any kind of coordinated way. Economic power, financial power, technological development, and so on. So surely leadership is part of the structural forces of power too, because they're the ones who, if you like, weld together the instruments of national power, if you like, into some sort of a belief system at the very least, or at least a concept. And you talked about systemic rivalry, but also the US calls China a strategic rival. Surely that formulation, constructed by political leaders, actors, foreign policy establishment figures, think tanks, and so on, surely that has a very large role to play within, even if so, you change from Trump to Biden, the fact remains that those concepts have been created through a discursive process of an understanding of America's global position, threats, rivalry, opportunities, and so on. So isn't it much more kind of integrated to each other, the structural and the agential, than sort of separated?
If I'm teaching class, I fully follow your suit. When I teach a student, definitely we will see the intertwine, that the structural powers and and the personal belief systems, the culture, identity, they mutually reinforce each other. That is the way. But in real politics, somehow the situation is quite different. No matter how the leaders play a constructive role today, the Ukraine war, somehow the war is shifted by some kind of structural force. No matter how, whether it is Polish president or this president, that president. That's why Xi Jinping doesn't want to play a big role in the war, because no matter how she says or he says, any leader says, somehow the war has been shaped or pushed by some kind of forces which is beyond human, what is called mind. So I don't know. It's very complex. Complex.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. It is very complicated, and I guess in the end, it's an empirical question. We have to look at very specific issues and instances, and perhaps we can see. Thank you very much for that. We'll come back to you in a moment. Rizwana, there's a question from one of our colleagues in the department, Sashi Sundaram, who thanks you for your brilliant presentation. And he says that the underlying premise of your argument, I suppose, seems to be that the ongoing levels of militarization, arms race, and distrust among India, Pakistan, and US-China rivalry is not really helpful for regional prosperity and so on. Yet he says there are important conflict entrepreneurs in these states, from the armed forces to radical publics in social media, etc., which are clamoring for war and exercising power politics. So they return to new histories to recover identities and also elect representatives to overcome past humiliations. His question is, how can policymakers forget the dreadful past of their relations and forge a progressive path ahead?
Yeah, thank you very much for your comprehensive question. I believe there is a lot of scope and space, but particularly I would like to talk about India and Pakistan to create new security environment and bury their past and thereby starting afresh. For example, there is need to start comprehensive dialogue. Within that comprehensive dialogue, Lahore Declaration that was basically initiated in 1999 is quite comprehensive, that seeks to resolve issues including disputes such as Jammu and Kashmir, that's promotes confidence building measures in all the domains. So through the revival of this declaration, I believe the two states may initiate step-by-step approach, and that step-by-step approach would lead to help them to build shared mechanisms to address cross-border terrorism, to initiate economic dialogue and promote trade, to initiate revival of existing steps for the revival of existing nuclear CBMs and other CBMs that they have undertaken in the past. So within that, the Kashmir issue that has changed its shapes, particularly after the revocation of Article 373 and 35A. So the issue can also be discussed, and the step-by-step approach can be adopted in order to somehow create some space to manage the Kashmir dispute at the bilateral level. So on multiple forums, I have also proposed that how India and Pakistan can initiate and craft a bilateral non-proliferation regime. Within that bilateral non-proliferation regime, they can introduce transparency, nuclear transparency measures. They can revive their existing nuclear related hotlines and CBMs. They can also promote strategic dialogue in order to constrain their budgets and restrain their nuclear modernizations by introducing arms control arrangements. So I believe that in my latest book, Building a Road to Nuclear Disarmament, I have given a comprehensive security framework for India and Pakistan, and particularly for China and India, as to how at the bilateral level they can minimize threats, maximize peace by promoting dialogue, and within that trade and economy would be and I would say economic interdependence would be a step forward to minimize mistrust, mitigate past, start a future road ahead in order to achieve economic prosperity for the people of this region, thereby alleviating poverty of this broader region. Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if I could just sort of continue on that line of questioning. Just two things. One is, do you, from your studies and knowledge of the region and the populations and civil societies of the region, do you see a kind of constituency in each one of those major countries which would support that kind of greater level of cooperation for development and for peace, prosperity, and so on? And secondly, what do you think is the role? Is it a benign or malign role that external powers to the South Asia-China relationship, what kind of role do you think external powers play in promoting or if you like, diminishing the chances of the kind of progress that you're looking for?
I would say the role of civil society is not prominent in the Southern Asian region. Globally, we have seen that civil society movement did play a very bright, very significant role in order to pressurize the governments. They were building coalition with the governments to promote global peace and thereby mitigating threats. But in the Southern Asian regions, yes, civil societies globally do play a role in South Asian context. They do not have that kind of leverage, that kind of dominant pressure over governments. But more so, I would say that international actors that play an important and significant role, particularly in the Southern Asian region, particularly in the context of India and Pakistan. United States, our superpower, did play a significant role in the past. It remained a broker in order to manage conflict between India and Pakistan and prevent escalation of conflicts on different occasions that we have witnessed in the past. But currently, global environment has shifted. US interests have shifted from Asia to Asia Pacific, from South Asia to Asia Pacific region. So Pakistan is not that significant player in their calculations. So United States priorities are no longer attached to South Asia, particularly managing conflict between India and Pakistan. But I would argue and I would say that international institutions got to play a responsible role, since the two countries are nuclear weapon states, and United States, having its past legacy in leverage over India and Pakistan, cannot overlook the two states bilateral conflicts, bilateral armed racing problems, bilateral escalation risks, and deterrence instability related risks. So I think international community, particularly United States, if United States is no longer a broker, then China got to play a role. How China will assert its power in the region, that is very significant. How China would sustain its economic growth, how China would maintain its alliance system, how China would obstruct the global, existing US-led institutional system and lead to clear leadership role in the South Asia, would determine in the near future probably how it, proceed ahead.
All right, thank you very much. We now get a question for Chen Chen from one of our colleagues in the department, Sean Stars, who thanks you for your paper. And he asks, Chen Chen, do you think the comparison between the alt-rights in the US and China breaks down when it comes to war? Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, et al. Are against the US proxy war in Ukraine, but from what I understand, many internet nationalists in China support the Russian invasion.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Well, they break down on many things because they position themselves on different sides of the great power competition between the US and China, right? But the commonality is only in the way of thinking. So initially there were lots of Trumpists in China, but then Trump went on a trade war with China. So still there were like, oh, we don't like that, but still they are like, he's so there's a saying that goes, a true evil person, it's still better than a hypocritical like seeming gentleman, something like that. So even though we don't like his stance toward China, but the way of thinking is something I identify with. And in terms of the specifically about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, if you remember, Tucker Carlson was initially rather sympathetic towards Putin, and I even used that quote in the slide, but it was very quick. So basically, he was using this xenophobic racism to voice support subtly for Putin, like he wasn't eating dog and he wasn't manufacturing a virus to destroy our lives, something like that. So I mean, it's really interesting that Putin is idolized among certain sections of the American far right, Putin and Dugin, his intellectual mind. And Putin is also idolized in certain sections of the Chinese online communities. And there were like, sorry about the noise, I can hear some noise. There are those crazy fan videos about Putin on the version of YouTube. So in that sense, there are still those fascinating resonances or parallels to look at.
If I just ask you a question as well. In most countries, I would think, in which there is a so-called alt-right, far-right, fascist right, whatever you would call it, it isn't a kind of a position which is so far removed from the mainstream political party or parties as well. So you often see on the extreme wings of the more right-wing parties elements of that type. And sometimes in the United States, for example, you have alt-right figures very close to the right to the heart of the party, if not under President Trump, actually in the presidency. So can you tell me perhaps about the Chinese alt-right and their linkages with the Chinese Communist Party or elements of the Chinese state? And the Chinese, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about the kind of nature of the Chinese Communist Party and its various wings or factions, which might be connected with this movement, because clearly made in China, China Dream, there's a kind of make China great again kind of message of nationalism, which is very powerful. So can you just comment on that, please?
Sure. Thanks. I did not, initially I did not approach this as a movement. I only approached it as a discourse simply because there's no space for any kind of political movement or political mobilization outside of the official venue within this, authoritarian setting. But I mean, on the alliance sort of similarity between the kind of ideology I studied and described and the official ideology. I think there's great similarity there, but it's not necessarily a product of propaganda. It's more like you have this grassroots feelings and sensibilities that really identify with the official stance. And it's quite mainstream, barring some extremist elements. Like there are very, very extremist, racist and Islamophobic elements in the kind of discourse I looked at. But when it comes to sort of hyper-masculine ideals of nation and society, and also in my paper, I called it realist authoritarianism. So it claims to be non-ideological, it claims to be pragmatic only. On those aspects, it's quite identical with the official ideology. And also part of the reason I was saying you don't need to have a movement is that like this party state is already sufficiently anti-feminist, for example, anti any sort of social movements, labor movements, and the party state itself is sufficiently Islamophobic by locking up, Turkic minorities in the northwestern region of Xinjiang. So all in all, it's like it's already sufficiently anti-feminist and sufficiently Islamophobic and so on. You don't really need to mobilize anything, but still there are those online influencers. They are doing some mobilization. They have been doing it recently by mainly asking their followers to report on other people. It's like online little snitching sort of things, especially reporting on LGBTQ and feminist groups in universities. There's already very, very limited space for these civil society organizations in China, right? We know. And then these nationalist influencers, they are basically mobilizing their followers to report on these groups, and they have got some success. So those groups were dismissed and so on. Yeah, I hope that.
Are these social knowledge sharing platforms, are they not licensed or protected by the Chinese state? Do they not exist within existing Chinese legislation?
Yes,
that is to say, they could be closed down if they were antithetical to the statist project, if you like. Then they could be closed down, but they're not, are they?
Yes. Yeah. Is this another reason why you're more likely to see pro regime comments online? I mean, it's not that there are no counter narratives. There are counter narratives existing mostly in the form of parody, irony, and the other forms. So I wrote a little bit about counter narratives in the recent paper about COVID narratives. But yeah, the censorship regime means that you are more likely to see very nationalist voices because other sort of voices are more likely to get censored, and then eventually those super nationalist voices get amplified, even if not intentionally.
And that's what makes me wonder about Rizwana's really good and optimistic view that when we look at the societies, the three societies that you talked about, the three states, there are very powerful domestic forces which have an idea of the external enemy as a kind of destabilizing force, as a force which is threatening. And I do wonder, therefore, the kind of impact that has on governments, which often are encouraging that kind of sensibility as well, and how that really militates against the idea of kind of regional cooperation in the way that you were talking about, Rizwana.
I think it's not the society, it's the leaders and the governments that control narrative in these societies. So it's a top-down model approach instead of applying, and conceding bottom-up model approach in Southern Asian region. So I think everything would flow from top to bottom. So yes, we can see polarization in these societies, particularly currently you say that first ever time in history of Pakistan, we have seen that people exerting pressure on governments and on establishment, thereby asking for their demands. So how this would lead up to reshape the framework of the society, that will be determined in the near future. But for now, I think the drivers are the personalities in this region and in the. But again, I would say considering current global economic crisis that directly impacts regional crisis and of course regional welfare of the people, that directly impacts regional economies, I think we have no way forward but to craft new economic mechanism, thereby building close economic interdependence and focusing more on economy, more on development, and less on security side of and traditional security side of it. So for that, I think, as I already highlighted, that there is need to craft new bargains, bargain compromises, new compromises demands new opening up space for dialogue, building trust and confidence on each other. Only then we will be able to achieve shared prosperity.
Sure. Thank you. We have a question from Abid Ali, another good friend of the webinar. And I guess he's directing it more at Lee here. And he congratulates the speakers on their fascinating perspectives. And he says, given Chinese vulnerabilities to global energy choke points like the Straits of Hormuz and Malacca, and additional pressure from the Quad, what would be the geopolitical impact of redirected Russian energy flows to China, which could bypass those choke points, coupled with any alternative global payment transaction system for a multipolar world? Maybe Lee, you could have a go at that.
Yes, thank you. Yes, China is indeed has been facing energy shortages for quite a long time. I remember when I was young in 1980, China was actually export of energy. So now it's the largest import of energies. That's why that one of the factors behind China's so-called support. China did not declare openly that China supports Russia, but indirectly that it's not only because of the joint statement between Xi Jinping and Putin just before the war. They had this joint statement in which they declared mutual support. But energy is also one of the key concerns, and one of the key what is called bet China is on the Russian side. That post-Russia win the war, not only the northern border become much more secure between China and Russia, then could also get a lot of cheap energy and cheap food products. Okay, so energy security, food security become two of the most important issues for China. So in that sense, an advantage for China. If Russia lost the war, then China is going to stand alone facing the whole West. And that is a disaster. So back to the previous question you asked for, Ms. Zhang, regarding state project and people's opinions. Today in China, it's not only driven by the state, it is also a kind of self-reflection, because for a long time, the Chinese have a feeling, whatever we do, whatever we say, we are demonized anyway. This is when I talk with my networks, families in China, they were shocked by, it's not by state propaganda machine. If you read, because today every Chinese, they have a VPN, they can jump the firewall. Even my family members, they jump, they know everything what happened. Yes, they are not allowed to publish their opinions openly within China. Okay, there is a limitation regarding freedom of speech, freedom of press, but they are not less informed. They are totally well informed. So, so it's very funny that during the pandemic period, because of Chinese pandemic policy, very few foreigners now are allowed to go to China, including me. So there is 3 years without any, very few foreigners. So it's a very good space for China to say, forget the West. I've heard a lot of discourse, forget the West, because when we engage with the West, we are demonized anyway. So whatever we do, whatever we say. Okay. So in that sense, that I think that whether it's a Quad security dialogue, whether it's as long as they are not affecting China's core interests, especially on the Quarter, China still trusts. Now we have a very good scholar, maybe Rizwana, maybe it's India or from Pakistan, I can't know. But I really believe that India is a smart player. India is not going to be stubbornly stick itself to one particular form of security architecture at the cost of abandoning other relationships. So I think India is clever enough not to go beyond. So that's why a lot of declarations by the Quarter, India wish to, rewrite some of the paragraphs, not to focus on China. So I know that.
Just another question. Sean Stars has asked it, and it occurred to me also that you're dealing, if you like, with national power, state power, and the economic and financial sinews of it, the military sinews of it. Rizwana sort of gave a very similar sort of analysis of the way in which world politics is moving towards multipolarity and so on. What about the fact that American firms are doing very well in China, making very large amounts of money, and much of that advanced high tech, which is so-called threatening to the United States and to the West, is produced by American companies in China. So that is to say, the interpenetration of economies and finances, even though it may be shifting slowly, it remains very large. So why do you, in that context, why would you say that war is inevitable, or this kind of coming military conflict perhaps is kind of inevitable between US and China in particular?
I think we need to separate the timing, okay? Here, your question actually was regarding the 1980s, 1990s, 2000. That's correct, that a lot of investment outsourcing coming from the United States. It's kind of deal, as I said in my PowerPoint, it's a deal that it's a mutual win-win situation, okay? But gradually, when China moved into the high tech, it became alarm to the United States. And also American companies began to claim, because China shift its growth model to high tech, in that sense that China become a competitor. So American, those big companies, they actually not earn so much money anymore, but financial capital, they begin to earn bigger money. So we have to distinguish productive capital and financial capital. They're two different. Today, China tried to lure the financial capital. Actually, if you read, when Trump tried to decouple a US economy with Chinese economy, actually the financial capital, they ignore. They come to Shanghai. If you see the Shanghai trade tower, actually I read from US sources, the offices, ranking offices are getting larger and larger, okay? So which means that the financial capital is really extending its power. But the traditional manufacturing sectors, they are not gaining as much profit as the old days. That's the difference.
Yeah, but that doesn't address the question really. You've nuanced it a bit, but the fact remains that the interdependencies, they're not perfectly equal, but the interdependencies and interpenetration, maybe that's a better way to put it, are so great that the decoupling of these and the breaking the bonds of these is actually going to be very, very damaging to both economies as well as the world economy. So would that not mean that the forces which are benefiting from those interpenetrations and linkages, which also have a large amount of political influence, particularly in the United States, would militate against that kind of drift towards
today there is an anti-discourse, because this is the typical liberal discourse saying that economic interdependence create peace. Okay, this is a typical liberal discourse, and as we always use U.S.-China economic interdependency as an argument that war would be impossible, but actually not the case. Trump's trade war was actually irrational from liberal point of view, but he got high support from many sectors. So actually, independence, they trigger even conflict like Russia's war in Ukraine. Look at Russia's energy interdependence with Europe. Europe is dependent on Russia, Europe is still sanctioning Russia at the cost of self-interest. So the world is sometimes very, very irrational rather than rational. So this kind of liberal discourse doesn't work anymore. People begin to rethink liberal discourse.
Actually, I'm not a liberal.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I'm liberal in many ways, but I'm not that kind of a political theoretical liberal. I was arguing much more from a kind of Gramscian and even Kautskian perspective.
I like it.
That there are actually interconnections between the sort of productive manufacturing, financial, and other interests around the world, and particularly between these two countries as well, which have that kind of particular function. But anyway, thanks very much for that. We are actually over the time that we normally have. So I want to say thank you. Unfortunately, Chen Chen has had to leave because of issues at home. But I want to say thank you to Lee for a really interesting presentation and Q&A, and also to Rizwana. I really like the very optimistic approach that you take, and I hope there is some ballast, political and other ballast behind it, which promotes it, because it'd be fantastic to see Asia united, or at least at peace and cooperating and interdependent genuinely, and so on. I think that would be great for the world and for people who live in those regions. It would allow them to spend less on arms and much more on social, economic, and other development. But thank you very much for your presentations. I'd like to say thank you to Oz for his work as well, and to Juvaria and to the audience for sticking with us for 6 weeks. And I want to say we've had a fantastic 6 weeks discussing the United States and so on, and its various kinds of drivers and relationships, etc. We've had a range of speakers from the global majority, global south, in conversation with scholars from the global majority in the global north, as well as global north scholars from the global north as well. We've had a really interesting educational time, and I want to thank them all for the work that they did over the 6 webinars. I want to thank all the partners we have in Brazil and Pakistan, in India, and in Germany, and in the United States, and in Cuba as well, for the kind of support that they've given and the ideas. They contributed ideas for our theme, as well as speakers for our panels and so on, which broadened our networks as well. So that's fantastic. That was the aim, one of the aims. We will be back. We're going to take the summer break, give you guys a break as well. We will be back in the autumn. We'll discuss with our partners and so on. But if members of the audience and our panelists, past and present, have ideas for future themes to be explored in our global webinars, then we're very happy and open to ideas as well. So please do feel free to email me, Oz, or Juvaria as well. And we recorded this webinar as well as all the others. We're going to put them onto YouTube and send them out via social media, etc., to all and sundry who are interested. But yeah, I just want to say thanks to everybody, and see you again in the autumn when we'll talk about something else. All right.
Thank you for the invitation.
Take care. You're welcome. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.